Hi there, I'm Roger Garcia and welcome to this Oakland Asian Cultural Center event. The month of May is designated in this country as Asia Pacific Islander Heritage Month, and every year various events are held to celebrate Asian Americans in this country. This year is a little special because PBS has produced and broadcast a 5-part series on Asian Americans, tracing the evolution and development and contribution that Asian Americans have made to the economic, political, cultural, and social life of this country over the past century. The 5-part series produced by Rene Tajima Pena is on the pbs.org website now until around the 8th or the 9th of June, so I hope you can catch it soon. Leo S. Chiang is one of the most talented documentary filmmakers working today. He produced episodes 1 and 3 of the series. I caught up with him for a chat about his work on the series. In this age of COVID pandemic, we chatted online, so apologies for any technical glitches. Leo was in Taipei and I was in the Bay Area. I began by asking him about how he started off as a filmmaker.
As you know, I'm mainly a documentary filmmaker, and I started my career in the U.S. Even though I was born and raised in Taiwan. Most of my film training and my film career has taken place in the U.S. Initially, my first few film was very much about a lot of Asian American subject matters. Specifically, I made 2 films in New Orleans about the Vietnamese American communities there after Katrina. But in the last several years, I find myself kind of drawn back to Asia more, both personally and professionally. So I ended up making a film in the Philippines with Johnny Simon's Outrun, about a transgender woman running for Congress. And then my most recent feature-length doc, which you showed in Hainan, is Our Time Machine, which was a collaboration with a Chinese director. So I think that I find myself drawn to family stories a lot, also stories about individuals who are kind of fish out of water, or people struggling with specific transitions in their lives. And usually what happens is they either, more often than not, what the story I end up telling is about them finding beauty and joy in the unusual, awkward, or uncomfortable transition that they're in, and then really embrace it and celebrate it. That's been my work, and I'm looking to do more work here in Asia, and looking to continue to develop my my work there in the U.S. as well.
So let's talk a bit about the PBS series that you were involved in, Asian Americans. Can you tell us what you directed 2 of the episodes, and episodes 1 and 3, and I wanted to ask you how you came to the project, and when you were on board, were you assigned the subjects or the material, or did you kind of say, oh, I really like this one? I mean, you're of the 3 filmmakers who made the 5 episodes, you are the Chinese filmmaker, if I can put it that way. So, and you do deal with the Chinese American scene, but as we will discover slightly later on in our talk, I hope, there are some other ethnic groups that are fascinating in your work. So I was just wondering, was this an assignment, or did you kind of all 3 filmmakers say to the producers, I'd like to do this one or that one or whatever?
Well, there was some discussion, and I think that it ended up becoming, in some ways, somewhat obvious that because I do know more about the Chinese history, that it made sense for me to take on the episodes that had more Chinese American content, and as do Grace and Gita. And also, Grace was particularly drawn to episode 4 because she does have a history of doing a lot of work, within the sort of a space of Asian American identity and the activism and the organizing side of it. So, and Gita, especially for episode 5, there's quite a bit of a story that takes place in New York. She's based there. So it all kind of made logical sense as we were moving forward. So it's a little bit of both. It was that the executive producers and series producer Renee thought that this would be a good fit, and we agreed.
And then in terms of the choices of some of the stories, were these also a mixture of, say, your affinity or your choices and what the executive producers, etc., wanted in terms of the program?
Yeah, so the series producer, Renee Tajima Pena, she had been developing this project with CAM and with WETA in DC, the PBS station there, for quite some time. I think I heard that it was about 10 years that it's been cooking in various versions. I think that a lot of the waiting was because they really wanted it to be led by majority Asian American creative team.
Yes.
And I think that timing was right in the last couple years that something like that was finally, and should have been, but was finally able to happen. So she had been bouncing some ideas around. There were some stories that she was really interested in. They had written a outline, basically these story modules, which we all looked at, and then for the episodes that we ended up directing, we reacted and we proposed alternate stories, or we proposed certain specific angles in the stories that was originally conceived. So I would say that maybe 60 or 70% of the original story ended up in the final episodes, and then new stories or new characters or new angles of a original story were added. For instance, the Hawaii story was not originally centered around Patsy Mink.
I see.
We felt like it was a much more interesting angle to look at Hawaii story, both as a sort of an Asian American civic engagement, first group of political leaders, and then also focusing on somebody who's been somewhat neglected historically, as a woman, as somebody who's didn't have as high a profile as somebody like Daniel Inouye, for instance.
Right. In your episodes, particularly the first one, you tell a very good, concise narrative. You uncover some very interesting things. For example, you start off with the first Asian Americans in America were in fact the Filipinos, because they came in the 18th century or something as shrimp farmers or something like this. Everybody expects you to start off with the Chinese and the railroads, but you start off with the World's Fair. This was a very important moment in the concept of Asian American, because you also go through this idea of racist anthropology, with the nose and the foreign, the idea of the savage, etc.
Well, we knew, I think all of us agreed, that we wanted to shake up this, conventional Asian American narrative being Chinese centric. It still is very much Chinese centric. I mean, we cannot change the fact that Chinese has been in the U.S. If not the longest, definitely the largest group for the most substantial amount of time. So clearly there are certain landmark stories that has to be acknowledged. But at the same time, we also want to, just from the get-go, tell the audience, look, this is a pan-Asian narrative that we're trying to construct here. We will, of course, acknowledge the Chinese story and tell these great stories that happen in the Chinese American community, but we want to set up, both that there are other Asian Americans, in the U.S. at that time, and that we want to be very clear that we want to look at this whole narrative through the lens of race, racial hierarchy, and and examine the unusual and fluid place that Asians as a group in the U.S. has on the racial hierarchy. I think more than any other group, and I mean, clearly Asians, that's such a broad, diverse term to group everybody in the same term. It's tricky already. But just as a group, it has a much more fascinating relationship to the idea of race than I would argue any other, ethnic groups in the U.S. Right? That some of them are seen as white and some of them are seen as black. You cannot really say that, with the most of the groups. And we feel like if we start the story there and then then move forward with it. It just sets up the audience perspective in a much more interesting way than starting with the gold rush or starting with the railroad.
Yeah,
the railroad story still comes on pretty early.
It does. I mean, the fascinating point of view in your episode in particular, I think, is this idea of the racial hierarchy, which leads us into very interesting areas as well. And did you get the sense in doing the research and thinking about it that the Chinese, for example, were trying to be the top of the pyramid? I mean, someone in the episode says, actually ethnic groups were trying to get away from being classified as black or African American. Everybody wanted to, the immigrants didn't want to be at the bottom of this terrible racist pyramid.
Yeah, I think that's Sharmila Sen, the writer, who's also I think she's the executive editor at Harvard. Yeah, Harvard Press.
Oh, right.
I love that soundbite, because it just reveals, this attitude as, it's very much human nature, right? Especially for immigrants, when you land in a new place, what you want to affiliate yourself with power, affiliate yourself with, the top of the food chain. I don't think it's just the Chinese that wanted to do that. I think everybody wanted to do that, but the Chinese was able to do that more than, let's say the Filipinos or the South Asians, because of the existing racial hierarchy, right? Chinese being a lighter skinned Asian, right? It has more of the opportunity to do so. Even that, then they weren't totally successful, right? Because U.S. being what it is, and seeing the immigrants as who they are.
Well, the trajectory of the Chinese to getting to the top of the pyramid, so to speak, is clearly shown by the introduction of the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, because white laborers or white labor were feeling threatened by what I assume is the growing economic power of the Chinese. And you talk about this fascinating character as well, the Tape, Joseph Tape and Mary Tape. And Mary Tape is the one who's brought up basically as a Caucasian girl. But, then she finds that society turns on her when they don't allow her daughter to go into what is essentially an all-white school in San Francisco.
The Tate family story is super fascinating, and a lot of that came from the work of May 9.
Right, the historian.
In the film. She wrote a book called The Lucky Ones, and it's actually a really great book. It even though it is a sort of, I don't know if it was published through an academic press, but it just reads like such intriguing, multi-generational family soap opera epic. I mean, it's a great read. I think that most people or most historians are familiar with the Tate versus Hurley case, which is one of the first cases that was around segregation, really, that led to segregation in the school. It was May's work that kind of built out the whole family, drama. I was particularly fascinated with the in-betweenness, right? I think that some of that comes out of who I am as a transnational person. Born in Asia, I spent most of my time in the U.S. At some point, I realized that outsider is my identity, that I am in between. And I saw very much of that in the tapes and in Joseph's tape, in the way that he is wanting to integrate but is unable to, but he is not quite where he comes from, so he's kind of stuck in this in-between space. So that to me is really fascinating, and I think that you can look at all the other stories in episode 1 and say that really about all the story of the people sort of trying to come to the US and become American and cannot quite.
The of course, the idea of the racial hierarchy comes to an interesting climax or situation with the Indian man, Mr. Bhagat Singh Thin.
That case was something brand new that I had no idea even existed. I had no idea at any moment in American history that South Asians were considered white. Actually, what I learned was that depending on the year that they entered the U.S., they could be considered white one year, but not white the next year.
Right.
In some ways, demonstrating the fluidity and the absurdity of a racial hierarchy, right, or the arbitrariness of a racial hierarchy. That case was fascinating, and we did a lot of reading because what they had to do to argue the case in court was to write these really extensive arguments, right? Like why is a South Asian person, why does a South Asian person should be considered white? And they would talk about these things about there's actually 4 kinds of white. There's the European white and the Japanese white, and just the argument and the language was from the modern point of view is so.
And the other interesting case that you come up with in your episode is Mokhtar Ali, this man, Mokhtar Ali, this man who comes, I think, from Calcutta or somewhere near Calcutta, and actually moves to New Orleans but who then marries an African American woman and has this family who only recently, it seems, discovered that they are part Indian.
The Mokhtar Ali story is interesting, right? A piece where that they were, both Vivek Ball, who's the writer and filmmaker, talking to the family about how Mokhtar is actually a darker skinned person than Ella, the American wife. But Ella was treated, as the second-class citizen, and Mokhtar was allowed with the kids who were all darker than Ella to sit in the front of the train, to be treated more as, sort of the in-between, still not quite have the full rights, but that's really interesting. There were additional stories in the Mokhtar Ali story that we actually had to leave out, which was a bummer, which was that one of their kids, Bardu Ali, ended up fronting the Chick Web band in Harlem, which was a swing band in the 30s or 20s and 30s.
Right.
And then eventually ended up discovering or giving Ella Fitzgerald her first job. And then ended up as Red Fox's manager in Hollywood in the 70s. And I think it's related to one of the singers in the band TLC. So it's just this a really unusual connection in the entertainment world. And sort of again this in-betweenness between the African American community and the South Asian community.
As far as you know, the Mokhtar Ali family and ethnicity, a combination, was that a unique combination, or were there other families like this? Were there other Indians? Because there were a number of these peddlers who were living in the New Orleans area. Did you know, or were you conscious of any other African American / Indian families?
In New Orleans, I'm sure they were, but I don't know personally. But Vivek Ball, who I mentioned, and who's the interviewee in that section, who is a historian and filmmaker based at MIT. His book, Bengali Harlem, is actually about all these Bengali men, which are the South Asian men, Indian men from Bengal, the eastern part of the subcontinent, in Calcutta, moving to New York and then integrating with African American and also the Puerto Rican community. So there's actually I've seen photos I imagine to be a critical mass of these interracial families in New York. On the West Coast, there had been historically many Punjabi, the Western Indians marrying Mexican women in California. There were communities that still practice some of the traditions and that's to acknowledge their heritage in California. So that type of integration is quite common. I think as relative to the smaller number of immigrants from India at the time.
I didn't realize that there was so much integration and intermarriage among the Indian community, which is traditionally very closed. I suppose you could say the same of the Chinese as well. But just one question. Did you feel that these different ethnic groups at this time, and we're talking about the late 19th century, I guess, were they rivals? Did they hate each other? Did they kind of stay away from each other? Or were they all in the same boat and felt that they had to pull together? Because the idea of Asian America pulling together or coming together comes in the 60s, it seems, according to the series. So at this time in the late 19th century, was it actually fragmented and were people at each other's throats?
Well, I think it's definitely late 19th and also early 20th century. What we found was that people came for labor work, right? So the Chinese came first, and when the exclusion happened, they had to import some other group to come in, to replace to fill the position that the Chinese weren't able to. So it was, I think the order was that Chinese and then Japanese and then South Asians and then Filipino. It's my understanding that for the most part, and maybe Hawaii being an exception, but for the most part, people came and filled different types of labor work.
I see.
The South Asians were doing lumber and milling up in the Northwest a lot. The Chinese were doing, the railroad work. I think the Japanese did a lot of farm work, if I'm not mistaken. I did not come across any clear examples of the groups kind of at odds with each other. But I imagine, in a place like Hawaii where everybody came, at the same time, all on the sugarcane plantation, that there must be some rivalry or feuding there.
You also touch on, you have a rather nice sequence about Hollywood and Asians, and particularly Anna May Wong, who of course is the tragic story that you tell, because she wasn't cast as the only Asian person in the Hollywood adaptation of The Good Earth. But Sessue Hayakawa is another case altogether, because in his time in the early 20s, he was as big as Rudolph Valentino. And you do have someone in the film saying that all these white women actually would lay themselves down in front of him. That sounds like a Hayakawa story, actually. I don't know how true that one is. Because he was quite a mischievous person as well, as I understand it. At that time, we assume that Hollywood studios thought that you couldn't really cast Asians in leading roles because nobody wanted to see them? That
was my understanding, especially not in bigger films. There are, genre films, right? I guess in some ways they're the Asian exploitation films that you could cast Asians in the leading role, or you would have roles that are something like in The Cheat, where Hayakawa was cast as this supposed to be Burmese ivory merchant, but clearly was shot and conceived as a Japanese person, and probably had to be adjusted because of the protests and the complaints from the community.
Right.
So, I mean, that was my understanding, that even if they're Asian characters, you have to cast a white person, right? The excuse was always that the Asians weren't big enough stars to be box office draws, but it's this chicken and egg situation of, well, if you don't ever give the Asians the opportunity or any other racial minorities the opportunity, then they will never become big enough box office draw to carry the pictures. Which is, you know, I mean, it's an excuse that's really used until just really recently, even now, right?
Yes. It's true. I mean, you have you can count the number of feature films which are mainly all Asian cast on one hand. Actually, you know, the Flower Drum Song, Joy Luck Club, and Crazy Rich Asians. But one of the issues, though, and I suppose this is a discussion for another time. However, is that you can, if you make rarely that all Asian type of film, and of course there are a number of indie films that are totally Asian as well, it's very difficult to actually get big audiences outside the US, and also you struggle with a smaller audience inside the US. I think more recently of Crazy Rich Asians, which, as you know better than I, didn't do very well in China at all. So
I think the interesting bit there is that I am, what I'm realizing is that folks in Asia are not necessarily interested in Asian diasporic stories.
Right.
They would go see, you know, big Asian cast in Asia, or even cast Asian Americans in Asia, but they will not, you know, be interested in an idea that was clearly, you know, even though Crazy Rich Asians supposedly had taken place in the Philippines, it's very American. I mean, in Singapore, it's very American. The narrative is very American. The attitude is very American.
Yes, but you know, if you replace the characters, the Asian characters in Crazy Rich Asians with Caucasians, essentially you end up with Sex and the City or something like that.
But maybe that's the reason why it was so successful in the U.S.
Yes, that's true. It's like the Joy Luck Club being a film about mothers and daughters, which is a staple of, you know, American melodrama as well as Chinese melodrama, actually.
You know, you bring up a really interesting point that I'm in some ways experiencing a little bit of it in the work that I do. I think I'm kind of an idealist. Maybe you're right, I'm an optimist. I fundamentally believe that there is this universality in the stories that we all are drawn to, because it's about humanity, it's about, you know, interpersonal relationships that are pretty much identical everywhere we go. But I am discovering that there are taste differences that is just not undeniable, and it's very hard to tell a story that is both fully embraced and accepted by the West and fully embraced and accepted by Asia. You know, even with you know, Our Time Machine, our last film, there were tricky things. There were reactions we're getting from the audiences on both sides that were almost the opposite, and we had to kind of make decisions about how to move forward. And so I can see something like Crazy Rich Asian or any kinds of bigger budget Western, you know, Asian American projects to have problems in Asia, and vice versa, that films for the Asian audience may not do so well in the West.
I hope you enjoyed our chat and that you'll be able to participate in other Oakland Asian Cultural Center events. In the meantime, I hope you can catch this important series on pbs.org. Thank you for watching.